Welcome back to Alive at 5. I'm your host, David Leonard, and it's my pleasure to spend some time on the phone today with Becky Rasmussen. Becky is the executive director of an organization known as Call to Freedom. They deal with the issue of human trafficking in our communities, and Becky is going to be speaking at the upcoming Spark Community Conversation taking place this Friday morning at 8:30 a.m. at the Avera Office Pavilion. I wanted her to come on the program and spend some time with me here today discussing human trafficking and why the organization Call to Freedom exists and the work that they do, the mission that they're attempting to execute. Becky, welcome aboard. It's a pleasure to spend some time with you here today.
David, thank you for having us, and we look forward to visiting with your community and the opportunity to talk about this subject.
Let's talk about Call to Freedom here at the beginning. Tell me a little bit about the organization. What is Call to Freedom? Who are you folks, and what do you do?
Yeah, Call to Freedom is a nonprofit 501c3 organization. We're an anti-human trafficking group that offers supportive services to those that have been victimized by human trafficking and sexual exploitation. And that really comes in many different forms. We really are working across the state of South Dakota to equip communities to be able to identify, respond to human trafficking situations. We also have a housing project where we actually house women that are coming out of trafficking situations. And so primarily what we do as an organization is offer case management to those that are coming in contact with human trafficking victims, and then walk alongside the survivors as they exit out of trafficking situations. A lot of times trafficking victims don't have access to immediate resources. Traffickers actually control their victim by controlling pretty much all of their life, and so identification, finances, clothing, addictions, that's how traffickers control their victims. And so if they don't have access to those immediate needs, it's very difficult for a victim of human trafficking to leave those situations because they don't have access to even being able to get a hotel room because they don't have finances. A lot of times they don't have their identification cards. And so we come alongside individuals once they're identified and make sure that the resources are in place so they can successfully transition out of human trafficking situations. We work with communities. We're really looking forward to working with Yankton. We've done some work in Yankton community along with River City Domestic Violence Shelter and other partners within the Yankton community to really equip your community. A lot of people say trafficking is not happening, and we started this organization, the work of the organization you see now, really in 2016, and we have served about 225 victims, direct service victims, since our conception, which is less than 4 years. So the more we get into communities, equip them, the more victims are coming forward. 3% of victims are ever identified, which means 90-plus victims go unidentified in human trafficking situations. The life expectancy of a human trafficking victim is 7 years because of the physical, mental, and spiritual abuse that they endure. And so really it's our job to help equip communities to know that this is a hidden crime. It is happening within our communities, and a lot of times people don't even know it. And so we want to come alongside and really give a safe place for victims of human trafficking to come out and talk about it. But once they do, that they have the resources in place to successfully transition out of trafficking situations.
Becky, I can tell from just the short time I've been talking with you here that this is an issue that you definitely have a passion for addressing and the work that you're doing. Tell me a little bit about that. Why is working on the human trafficking issue something that you're willing to put so much time and effort into?
Yeah, when you meet these individuals that are trapped in trafficking situations, they are the most incredible individuals to work with. They've survived circumstances that most of us would never survive. The stories we hear working with service providers, working with victims, are things that nobody should ever have to hear that occur and have happened to these individuals. And so when we are able to come alongside them, get them out of those situations and live life with them, that they become productive members of the community and they're outside of that lifestyle. Nothing gives myself and my team more joy than to do that. And they are definitely worth the fight. And, it's one of those things that human trafficking is a hidden crime. We don't talk about it, and it doesn't get revealed until we start talking about it and shedding really light into the darkness. Because if you don't start exposing what it looks like, talking about that it's really happening within our communities, then we go on with our daily lives like it's not even there, and that is not the reality in South Dakota.
Let's talk about that for a moment. The fact that it, as you put it, it exists, but people don't talk about it. It more or less, it flies under the radar, and I think people are more aware of human trafficking now than they were, say, 5-10 years ago. But I also think there's a lot of room for improvement in that area. Why is this a crime that flies so far under the radar and many people don't even know exists?
Yeah, it is one of those hidden crimes because traffickers are very smart in how they facilitate business. Because to a trafficker, and a trafficker is one who actually, human trafficking is defined as this: to use force, fraud, or coercion to exploit somebody for either sex or labor trafficking. And so, most people, I would say, how many people have seen the movie Taken, and people raise their hand, and that's where somebody was actually physically kidnapped and put into those situations. But traffickers have gotten a lot smarter. They don't facilitate it in those ways that are easy to prove. They actually use more of the coercion technique, which is part of the law in defining human trafficking. And coercion is kind of similar to some of those domestic violence, stalking, building relationships. A large percentage of people that are trafficked know their trafficker before they're even pulled into trafficking situations. Probably one of the most common that we see in the state of South Dakota is what we call familiar trafficking, or homegrown, it's referred to as both, which is family members or somebody that the victim knows that have actually trafficked them. We've had individuals who've come in who have been trafficked by their mothers, their fathers, aunts, uncles, boyfriends, and they don't immediately introduce them into human trafficking situations or sex trafficking or labor trafficking situations. Typically, there is a process called grooming and recruiting, which means they begin to develop this person, they gain trust with this person, and once they have that trust, it may be giving them places to live. 1 in 6 homeless individuals within 48 hours are pulled into human trafficking situations because traffickers look for individuals that have vulnerabilities. And so vulnerabilities come in homelessness, through addictions, through relationships, broken relationships. One of the most common and probably the hardest to detect is family members trafficking their own children. And we had a young girl that came through our program about 2.5 years ago, and the domestic violence shelter in that community asked her 3 questions. And she was in her early 20s, and she answered yes to all 3 of those questions. And when she answered yes, they said, "Have you ever heard of Call to Freedom?" She said no. She was in her 20s, but she was groomed by her father from age 3 to 7. And age 7, he was selling her to friends and to business partners. And she never knew any different because the person she trusted the most was the person who exploited her, but she didn't know that that was wrong because that's the person who took care of her. And that's really what we see a lot of trafficking being, is where these traffickers have gotten very smart in how they facilitate this, where they build relationships. We've had clients where they've actually dated them up to 6 months, introduced them to family partners, and then taken them to a weekend trip and exploited them and didn't allow them to come back to their family members. And so trafficking is very hard, and a lot of times trafficking victims don't even know they're being trafficked because they trust the person who is exploiting them in the trafficking situation. And then we have events within our community, within the state of South Dakota. We hear about Sturgis Rally. We hear about hunting season. And anytime you have large groups of people in community events, you have this ability for trafficking. And trafficking has three entities. It's number one, you have to have a demand, somebody who wants to purchase or wants to purchase this from the trafficker. And so if you have somebody who is buying somebody for sex or wants to exploit somebody for labor, you have a demand side. And then you come to the next step where it's a trafficker, and the trafficker is the one who facilitates it like a business. And I always say if we don't address the demand, we're going to have more victims today than we ever have in the history. 40 million people on a global level are in human trafficking situations today, and that's more than any time in history. 3,287 individuals on a daily basis on a global level are pulled into human trafficking situations. And so when we have vulnerabilities within events, like I talked about Sturgis and hunting season, there's always that demand and that need for demand. And so anytime traffickers know that there is that demand and people that are willing to facilitate that demand, they're going to find the product and bring the product in to facilitate trafficking. And then we talk a lot about transit trafficking. We have, South Dakota people are the most amazing people, very Midwestern, but very trusting. And so it's easy for somebody from another community, another state to come into our area and look for individuals that are very trusting and build relationships with them and then take them across state lines and traffic them in other communities. And so we've had individuals who we've served who have actually been married to their trafficker. They dated them, they ended up marrying them, and then once they married, then the exploitation of human trafficking began. And so it really is one of those hidden crimes that sometimes, we talk about the 3%. Sometimes, most of the time, trafficking victims don't even know they're in trafficking situations because the coercion factor and the trust factor is so real.
Becky, you've mentioned a couple different aspects to this issue, and I think that's important for us to talk about here as well, as because obviously there's definitely sexual exploitation that's taking place, but there's other types of human trafficking as well. And it all kind of, I guess, it fits under that same umbrella, but they are yet maybe interrelated but still separate in a lot of ways. There's also trafficking for labor purposes. We've seen that take place here in South Dakota as well. Tell me about the different types of trafficking, human trafficking that take place.
Sure. And you actually mentioned both of them, David. So, first of all, sex trafficking is exploiting somebody for sex, which means that if there is an exchange of money or force, fraud, or coercion was used and you don't receive that money back, those could be sex trafficking situations. And so a lot of times in the sex trafficking situation, we'll talk about that first, they will keep them, they'll have their housing, they'll keep their identification card, they will keep them in a controlled environment, take them from people that they trust. They create a lot of fear dynamic within their victims. So they don't make eye contact. They feel like they can't disclose. These traffickers are very good about creating a wedge between a victim and law enforcement. And a lot of times what they will do is put the victim that is being trafficked in misdemeanor or felony positions. A lot of the crossover between drug trafficking and sex trafficking is very real, and it's usually an intersection between those. So there's a number of clients that we've worked with that have been pulled over for distribution or possession charges, and their trafficker is making them facilitate this into two things. They can get a charge, and then I can control them through their charge, because now the police are never going to believe you because you're a felon or you're a misdemeanor. And so, that type of coercion. When you talk about labor trafficking, where we have seen, and there's a lot of work to be done on the labor trafficking side, and that's fairly new for us, but what we are seeing is within the immigration population is where kind of our focus has been, and we know that there's more in massage parlors. We know that it's happening in strip clubs. We know that it's happening in some of those venues that people frequent, but don't really know how to look for the signs. And so labor trafficking is somebody who works them for endless hours, controls their paycheck, controls their living situation. And I remember doing a training and somebody said to me, well, they show up for work every day. Well, if you're an immigrant who comes over on a temporary visa and you're promised a great job within a community and you get here and it's nothing that you're promised, their trafficker is typically their only translator. So the only form of communication that this particular person, if they're an immigrant, has is the translation of their trafficker, which is usually mistranslated. Number two, they don't understand the culture. So they might think what's happening to them is very normal, that they work 60 to 80 hours a week and they're not fed, nor are they paid or compensated for their work. A lot of times they're put into housing environments where there's multiple people living within one house. All of those are red flags. It doesn't always mean it's a trafficking situation, but if they are controlling, working them endless hours and not paying them, we're talking about labor exploitation or labor trafficking. And we've had a case many years ago that was in the Chamberlain area that was a hotel, and they were bringing in immigrants from the Philippines. And when they brought them over here, it's kind of the situation that I talked about. We're working them and these particular individuals until a community member reported it, did not know that they were in an exploitation situation. And so it's really up to our communities to understand the signs, and if you see something, you can definitely report it. And it's important to do both of those. If you see something, to report it. It's the law enforcement's job to follow up on it. It's our job as a community to know the signs, be aware, and reporting it to those that can do something about it if it is an exploitation situation.
I'm visiting this afternoon with Becky Rasmussen. Becky is the executive director of an organization known as Call to Freedom, which deals with the issue of human trafficking here in South Dakota. Becky, let me ask you this. Regarding the victims of human trafficking, is there a typical person? Is there somebody that I guess more prone to this than other people, or do the victims of human trafficking really cover the entire spectrum of different people?
It really depends on the ring that is trafficking. And when I say that, is human trafficking is organized crime. Domestic violence, DV, usually has one perpetrator. In human trafficking, you have a trafficker and you have a ring that surrounds that particular situation. And so it creates another dynamic. So how they recruit is based on the demand. So if a demand wants a middle-class girl, blue-eyed, blonde-haired girl because it's more upscale demand, the trafficker is going to meet that demand by finding that victim. And so the demand really, really drives the victims that traffickers go after. And so understanding how that process works means that, a lot of times people think it's people who are vulnerable, which is very true. However, because that demand drives what the trafficker brings or fills, it really, victims of human trafficking come in many different forms. I've talked a lot about young ladies. There's also demand for young boys. The average trafficking victim, anywhere from, there's two stats, 12 to 14 is the average age of a trafficking victim. And so that means that there's been some younger and there's been some many older that are older. And so the victims are really driven by what people are asking for, and then the traffickers will go fit those bills. So we've seen families that have trafficked their own children, like I talked about. We've seen gangs within communities that have trafficked. I think one of the things to talk about, too, is that traffickers come through communities, right? So they're driving through communities. So if they can meet somebody and build a relationship with them that meets what the demand is asking for, they'll do that grooming recruiting that we talked about. So there is not one particular look or one particular dynamic for a trafficking victim. A lot of times trafficking doesn't happen, within our environments. It happens online. So when they recruit, I guess, when I'm talking about recruiting and grooming, traffickers will be on social media. We've had where people have tried to recruit from the game Minecraft, where a guy was making contact with a kid on Minecraft. We had another one where a young boy, mom came to me and she said, my son has a one-way ticket to Florida, and he met this particular woman, but we don't know if it's a woman or not. We don't know who is communicating with him. And this individual, it was supposed to be a she, sent him a one-way ticket to Florida. And she goes, something's wrong, and he really wants to go because he believes that this woman, the 16-year-old boy, believes that this woman loves him. And so the mom intervened on that behalf. So they'll go online, they'll look at Facebook pages, they'll look at Instagram, they'll go on Kik, they'll find some of these online tools where they can look at people's profiles. So I always say to family, if you have young kids who are on social medias, make sure that their social medias are protected and that only friends that they know, they accept to be able to know things about their life. Also keeping your settings private, because what will happen is a trafficker will say, a young kid he'll maybe be friends with, and they'll say, my parents hate me, boom, target. I would never treat you that way. I will always love you. And what they'll try to do is draw that person away and take them to the place where they can separate from those that can help them, so that they can control that person there forward. We've had others where have gotten promises of modeling jobs. You look like a beautiful model. This is a great job. It's in this area. I have a one-way ticket. So when you ask about victims, it really depends on what the demand is looking for, that they will find a way to fulfill that demand, if there is that.
In your experience, how difficult is it for the court systems, for law enforcement to arrest these people and then to prosecute them and get convictions? How difficult is that process?
Yeah, it's a very complicated process. As I said, traffickers, this is organized crime. This is business for them. So they get very good at the business that they're facilitating. And so there's a lot of, we have great law enforcement, we have great a U.S. attorney, great AG's office, everybody that are very good in their positions. However, if we don't know how to identify it, we don't ask the questions, and we don't have the resources dedicated to this, it's very difficult to prove. For example, in a narcotics case, distribution, possession, you actually have a physical product. But as I said before, in a human trafficking situation, you have to prove force, fraud, or coercion, and you need the assistance of the victim in that case, that crime victim in that case. What traffickers do is they become very good at getting them addicted to drugs, so they're not credible witnesses. They get them where they have a lot of mental health because they're so broken in these situations. And so they're very smart that they will actually get the victims where they are not able to remember details of a case. Complex trauma for a trafficking victim is very real. But if you have to prosecute a case, you actually have to prove what hotel were you at, what time did you call, details of what happened. And when you are a person of trauma and have experienced trauma, your body suppresses a lot of those memories. And so the victims of human trafficking are very difficult to prosecute these cases because of the dynamic of trafficking. And so with all of those tough situations or those challenges, it makes it very hard to prosecute the cases. And a lot of time you have to be proactive. Like I said, 3% of victims are ever identified. So victims don't just walk into a place and go, hey, I'm a trafficking victim. They don't self-disclose for a multitude of reasons. So we as first responders, so those that are in domestic violence shelters, those that are in the medical community, those that are in law enforcement, those that are in addiction centers, those that are in gas stations, have all the ability to really understand the signs, the warning signs, ask the questions, and then help provide those resources to a victim so that they can feel safe first and foremost, and then get them the help they need so that they can, move forward or process of prosecuting these cases. And so there's just a lot of layers that make it very difficult. And it also, from a law enforcement standpoint, it requires a lot of resources. You have to be specialized to really understand the dynamic of human trafficking. And you know, a lot of our law enforcement have very limited resources, and so it really takes those that understand how to prosecute these cases and to be able to dedicate a lot of time and energy towards prosecuting them as well.
Let me ask you this, Becky. It sounds to me that one of the things you're telling us here today is that there's no one agency, no one entity, no one organization in any community that can tackle this issue. This is something that really it requires partnerships, and it requires cooperation from a number of people and organizations throughout a community to begin to address this issue. Am I getting that right?
Absolutely. We cannot, I always say, one of the things I say, this is not a call to freedom issue. This is a community issue. It takes a community understanding human trafficking, being proactive to incorporate assessment questions and responses within communities. But we as an organization, we primarily do case management, which means we come alongside and we help the victims and survivors find the services that they need. But we can't, as an organization, physically provide all of those services. So we collaborate with communities. We collaborate with mental health. We collaborate with addiction communities. We collaborate with the domestic violence shelters, River City Domestic Violence Shelter there in Yankton. We collaborate with these entities. We collaborate with law enforcement, FBI, anybody who's involved with making contact within that community. And then on the flip side, it's also our community. You have a voice. If you see something, you say something, and that's extremely important. There have been multiple times where a community member noticed that there was something not right, and they actually then said, you know, there's a lot of traffic coming in and out of that house. There's a dark Tahoe. There's a young girl with a bunch of older people. She doesn't make a lot of eye contact. She won't interact with them, and they just said, you know, they could be facilitating drugs, or it could be that something just didn't report it. And that allowed law enforcement to intervene on that situation because somebody within the community reported something that did not look right, and then law enforcement had the ability to go follow up on it and actually have saved multiple human trafficking victims because of it. So this is a community initiative, and I can't say it enough. It is not one of the fun topics to talk about. Human trafficking is not something that anybody wants within their communities. But if we don't talk about it, if we don't be proactive, we will not intervene, and we will not say to others that are bringing this within our communities that we're not going to stand for this, that this is not something that we want it facilitated within our communities. So we as a collective community have a voice to combat this and to be able to serve those victims. And this is one of the things that I always, and I'm very passionate about this, when victims come in, they say, I can't believe you believe me. You believe me. Some of the things that happen to these victims are so, nobody wants to believe it because it's not fun to talk about. But they need to be believed, and we need to give them a safe place where that they feel like they can come forward to be believed and to get the help that they need. So this really is about a community coming together to say we're in it to end it, and we're not going to have this anymore.
Becky, this has been a great conversation with you here today. We're just about out of time, though. If somebody listening to this would like to get more information on the Call to Freedom organization, what's a good way for them to do that?
Yeah, we are at probably our website. I would say go to calltofreedom.org. If you'd like to know more, we have a bunch of information on our page that you can submit, want to know more. We also have monthly luncheons. We are located in Sioux Falls. However, our next direction is we're integrating into communities. So in Yankton, we are partnering with a River City Domestic Violence Shelter to put positions to be able to help trafficking victims from their shelter. So we're collaborating with them, so they will be a great resource as well within the Yankton community. But if you want to know more about Call to Freedom, it's calltofreedom.org. If you are in a community, if you see anything that is a red flag and you want to report something to law enforcement, there's two ways to do that. Number one, the National Human Trafficking Hotline is 1-888-373-7888. That is actually a statewide reporting, and it will get allocated to the appropriate law enforcement that are trained to be able to identify trafficking. Or if you have a local Crime Stoppers, that is another anonymous way to report. They will then dispatch the law enforcement within your community that are trained to handle trafficking situations. So that is a way that a community can report something as well.
Becky, I want to take a moment now to thank you for spending this time with us here today. We've appreciated hearing from you.
Thank you, David. We appreciate you giving us a voice. Thank you for having us.